Hello and welcome. We're going to start to have people come in here. Happy Wednesday. It is Wednesday. I did check beforehand because these short weeks tend to get people somewhat confused. So if you are here and with us, we welcome you. We're welcoming you to today's virtual expert discussion on onboarding post-COVID. We're going to talk transitions, first days, company culture for new employees, and hopefully answer a lot of the questions that you have going forward. I am Meg Kearns. I am Boost's Director of Marketing, and I will serve as your moderator today. So as we get started, remember, put your questions in the chat. We'll go through some of the ways that you can best participate here in a moment, but just to make that statement in the beginning, go ahead and put your questions in there. If we do not get to all of those questions, we'll keep a record of them and make sure that we can get back to you post-event if necessary. Also, to make sure you can hear us, and that we can see your chat features in there. If you would just put where you're joining us from today into that chat so we can see, that would be great. Bonus points if you're joining us from a beach, a lake, or from the mountains. We will all be jealous together. So go ahead and stick that right there in the chat so we can see and make sure that you all can hear us and we're well connected. A little bit about Boost before we get started here. Boost offers strategic corporate support for growing businesses in the government contracting arena. We provide services in the area of managed accounting, branding and marketing, contracts, human capital management or HR, recruiting and sourcing, and strategic pricing. So today we have brought to you two of our directors to speak on how exactly you can get from recruiting and sourcing and finding really great new top talent to onboarding them appropriately and effectively and welcoming them into a new community. So we've got people in here. We've got Falls Church, Southern Maryland. We've got Northern Virginia, people home offices. A lot of us are in the home offices, which is going to be a big topic of conversation here. So welcome, which we've just done. Participation tips we're going to go through here in a second. Just to remind you, we've been on a lot of these. Ours at Boost, our digital events tend to be a little bit different as we are not slide heavy. So you're going to see our speakers today conversing with each other because this is truly an expert discussion here. So we hope to have a lot of that and invite you to answer or ask any of those questions to have us answer. So for those tips today, remove those distractions. I know you've heard it before. Some of you might be doing the digital learning with your kids, and we all know that they can be distracted. So go ahead, close down that email. It's only an hour. If we can get you some time back that's less than an hour, that's even more of a bonus, but go ahead and close that down so you're not distracted and you don't miss anything. You should not be able to unmute your microphone, but if for some reason you have like a superhuman computer that's able to do that, just leave that microphone on mute. Be active in the chat, and as we said, post your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. I'm actually going to let them introduce themselves. The first one that we're going to introduce is Caitlin. So Caitlin, if you will tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at Boost.
Absolutely. So glad to be here this afternoon. I am the Director of Recruiting for Boost. What we do, as Meg had mentioned, is work with government contractors primarily. Most are somewhere on the East Coast, but of course nationwide. And what we do in my division specifically is the talent acquisition piece of the business. That's everything from kind of your transactional recruiting in terms of filling roles and spots, both proposal funded and one work backfills as well, or even corporate internal. And then the other piece is more of the strategic kind of design, both in terms of going after work and funded work, and then even transitioning once your business is kind of crested and you're looking to in-house, we help you then also hire your own in-house team. So I do a whole lot of talent acquisition strategy and people work here with Boost.
Very much so. Thank you so much for joining us today, Caitlin. And Nicole, we're going to go ahead and send it over to you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen to what we have to say and our quote unquote expert opinions. I am Nicole Ferritto. I am the HR director here at Boost, and me and my department, we support government contractors primarily with all of their HR needs from day one to life cycle and hopefully retirement over termination. We do strategic HR consulting. You come in, you need help, you have no HR department, we help you build one. We do strategic HR assessments. where we tell you where we think you need to be given your pipeline and where you see your business in 3 to 5 years. We also do primarily HR generalist work. So if you need an HR position, you don't have the means to have one full time, you need us on a consultant basis, we can come in and do your HR, do your generalist duties, your entries in the system, things like that. So we have a wide range of HR needs that we can help you fill.
Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and stop to share, which means that you're going to see our faces in the top corner there of your view. There should be an option that says gallery view. You'll be able to see us kind of pop in here so we can see everybody's faces. You might be able to adjust that on your side just to kind of make the experience a little bit better for you. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions for today. The first one being, and I'm going to throw it over to Caitlin first. Now that many businesses are moving to a more permanent online structure, how do they better market for new hires?
So I think it's a great point, right? A lot of us are, if you hadn't pivoted before and been a part of that virtual remote workforce, you certainly are now, whether through force or through preference, right? You've shifted, you're like, this makes sense. We can cut overhead. We can, expand our candidate base. So for recruiting's purposes and talent acquisition strategy, I think it's really crucial that a business kind of take a step back and truly rethink that, like, okay, our entire target audience just became nationwide, if not global, depending, of course, on your business and clearance level and whatnot. So to kind of think much grander and much larger in terms of those that you can tap into and who you can consider a candidate and where might they live, and is the cost less, somewhere in Oklahoma versus here in Arlington? Is it possible to do that? And then if it is, and most oftentimes it actually is, then kind of pivot your entire strategy that way, meaning, your marketing, your job postings, your sourcing, all of that scales way up in terms of the actual geographic locations that you can target, which again, of course, then can oftentimes bring down your cost as well. So I think it's awesome that it's moving, to that kind of remote virtual structure over more of those kind of hard button seats, physical locations, 9 to 5. For a number of reasons. So I think in recruiting, it's been a wonderful addition to our world. And I think that most GovCons can absolutely seamlessly make that pivot work for them.
Perfect. And I'm going to ask a quick question, which would be, I see a lot, especially from my side, of the LinkedIn recruiting. Is that something that you are seeing on your side as being more prevalent now because everybody is online, or is that kind of just an ebb and flow as part of the usual things that are going on?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. There's certainly an increase in terms of it being a targeted source for us to reach out to candidates and whatnot. And of course, thinking, okay, great, I don't have to be right here in the DMV, I can be anywhere. So LinkedIn, but again, any of your job boards or candidate wells, if you will, people that you can find. I think in GovCon, it really, honestly, it all depends on your structures, your contracts, your clearance level, because a vast majority of them, especially at your poly level, full scope poly TSCIs, may not be the best LinkedIn in terms of where you might find them. You wouldn't know that they have a clearance, for example, unless you're kind of doing incumbent capture or have more of an intel approach to your work in terms of the people that you're targeting, so that you would know that ahead of time. So I do think it's actually a little bit of both. I think it's that increase in our ability to view candidates nationwide or even globally, again, depending. So you're definitely seeing an uptick there, but then also, we're all now at home with computers. So there's only so much or so many ways that we can reach out to you. Whereas before, I would like physically go to places or physically network. Now we're forced to kind of do it through this conduit instead.
Right. So that house at the beach is actually more of a possibility now because I can work from there. The next thing I'm actually going to throw over to Nicole. Nicole, once an employee has agreed to join the team, so great, we found them and they're wonderful and we're ready to hire them and they've said yes. What do companies need to have in place before their first day? And I know this is a very large question, so you can give us the high points there.
It's actually not a large answer.
Oh, good.
So in my professional opinion, there aren't that many changes to the onboarding landscape post-COVID, because in any situation, you want to make sure that your onboarding process is robust and you treat your employees like your new hires like they're your highest priority. So I think the other thing that I want to mention before I forget is that onboarding doesn't stop on day 2. in my opinion, an onboarding process is at least 6 months. You can even consider it up to a year, because for the first year you're at a company, you really, for the most part, have rose-colored glasses on. You think everything you have is great because you've not seen anything, or you haven't had the chance to really reflect on. So in any situation for onboarding, you want to make sure that everyone is set up on day one, that all of their stakeholders know that they've got a new, if they have stakeholders, that they have a new representative coming in to help them. Any laptops, desktop computers, if they need a docking station, any equipment, phones, anything like that, you should have ready for them at least 48 hours before that first day. And I don't mean 48 calendar hours, but 48 business hours. That way, if there is something that you've forgotten or your schedule becomes so hectic because as a hiring manager, your schedule can get hectic with a blink of an eye. So, but that new hire, everything that you do, especially in those first few weeks, is heightened because the new hire doesn't have as much to do. So the optics need to be as great as they possibly can. But since so many of us are onboarding remotely, myself included, there are some things that you need to take into special consideration when you're onboarding from a completely remote perspective. I think that it's very easy to feel like you're on an island when you're not in an office with your coworkers. So if I have a problem finding a document or, finding where, how to get onto the payroll system, I can't walk into someone's office and say, hey, can I ask you some questions? You have to go onto Teams or you have to go onto Skype, and you might not get an answer right away. And then you're sitting there feeling kind of, not sure what to do. And you really feel like you're on an island. So it's really important that for those first few weeks, I would say at least 12 weeks, you have to have some leniency with what is expected of your new hire, because they're not going to pick on as quickly, especially if they've never onboarded in this type of environment before, if they've never worked remotely. And even in cases where people have onboarded remotely, there still needs to be some extra attention paid to that new hire. Checking in with them, once or twice a day. It may seem like overkill, but at the end of the day, it's not.
Like that, hi, how are you? Hi, how are you?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that, hey, is there anything that you're having problems with? How was your day? Things like that. And so I just think it's important to remember that and to really have some leniency. And I'm not saying to just ignore things that you're not getting, but really set very clear expectations and know that it's a lot more difficult. It's difficult in a normal setting to onboard, because I always tell hiring managers, for the first 6 months, monitor their productivity, but know that it takes you twice as long to find things on the drive on SharePoint. It's twice as hard to know who to go to for things because you don't know. So expecting them to meet hard deadlines, know who everyone is, know who to go to, a month into the job, that's really unrealistic. So, I tell hiring managers all that time, you have to give some leniency. And right now, it's especially important that you do so. And, again, I think I cannot stress enough making sure that all of your infrastructure is there and available for them, even a few more days in advance, so that they can at least log in, make sure that their emails are set up, things like that, because those are the types of things that employee remembers and said, well, I had a difficult onboarding. I don't know
Right.
if this is really for me. And so that's my recommendation.
Definitely. So a lot about balance, a lot about remembering, and giving time for the
Absolutely.
human portion of onboarding a new hire.
Absolutely. And the one last thing I'll say is, if you have an employee that is a really hard worker, they're not going to be that hardworking for the first few months, because again, for these very same reasons, that an employee that is performing, their performance in the first 3 months is not at all what you can expect 6 months, 12 months down the road. And you have to remember that.
Right. No, that makes good sense, and kind of just making sure that though we do expect things from them when they join a new company, as far as meeting their deadlines and things like that, they may be able to better facilitate that later on as well as they continue on in the process. So that's
Correct.
a very good point. And on the note of bringing people in, especially in this post-COVID, everybody's remote or continues to be remote when possible, is there a PPE requirement for companies, regardless of where they're working, either at their homes or in an office or at a co-working space? Do we have information on that?
Oh, that's a hot button issue right now. And a
Love
lot of
hot button
people,
issues.
yes, that is a hot button question. So I did some research and I also consulted with our employment attorney because when I looked on OSHA's webpage, and I even looked on some state web pages, there's a lot of differing information as to what is technically required. So when I consulted with our attorney, she told me that at the federal level, OSHA does not have requirements for PPE. And as a matter of fact, masks are not considered personal protective equipment. Cloth masks definitely are not. So the general duty clause can come into play, but it's a little wishy-washy. So my recommendation, because culture is so important right now, more important than ever, again, because you're in a remote situation. So you've got all these employees that are not geographically located necessarily. And if they are, they're not meeting in offices. And Caitlin kind of touched on this. It is a hot job market, GovCon or not. And if you have a clearance, you can bounce in a day and you can bounce for a lot more money. So it's really important that you work hard to retain your talent. And that's why I think this conversation is so important, because a majority of people, when they leave the organization, leave within 2 years. And then it significantly drops as tenure gets longer. So my point being is that, yes, OSHA doesn't require it, but it's in your company's best interest to take those precautions, provide masks, provide hand washing stations, hand sanitizer. My last company, we had cleaners come into the skiffs 3 times a day. And so you can imagine the logistics behind getting an uncleared cleaner to come into a skiff. It was quite difficult. But we made it happen. And, we had plexiglass in some places. We had very stringent requirements for getting, for employees when they sit at their desk and when they move around and when they go to use the restroom or they go to lunch, so those are important to have that infrastructure in place. However, nothing is technically required by law. With that being said, I would always go to your own employment attorney. That's my biggest recommendation, just to double check, because states and some localities, like you think about California in particular, if you're in California, I would check 5 different websites and then consult your employment attorney and then go back and check those websites again, because I don't know California law inside and out. I think I know it better than a lot of people on the East Coast with regards to employment, HR in California. California is for sure going to be the one that's going to have the most stringent requirements.
So when in doubt, ask your lawyer friends.
When in doubt, ask your lawyer. So that's all I can say. But legally, OSHA does not require it, but I highly recommend it.
No, that's great advice. And Caitlin, when you are in the process of, interviewing and that sort of thing, do you have a lot of people who are asking about the PPE requirements or things that are going to be facilitated through that? Is that something that's coming up now, or does that not typically come up until after they've signed an agreement?
No, that's a great question. It actually does come up usually in the context of, is this job remote just right now? And then there's the anticipation of it being on site whenever, right? Like whenever we all go back to whatever that is. And so depending on that answer, then that kind of comes into conversation, right? So everything from, but to be honest, most of our experience in the most recent past has been that the pivot is permanent to the remote virtual environment, and there is no actual anticipation of it going back on site. There have been huge government contracts that have said, hey, you guys have been performing remotely well for the last 6, 7, 8 months, whatever it's been. And it makes no sense to us to force this to go back on site. So we're just going to, in perpetuity moving forward, it will always be remote and virtual. Honestly, most of the time, the answer that I have to give is that it is, this is here to stay, the remote virtual component of the role. But if it's not, and then there is that on-site anticipation, then that kind of shifts the conversation. And that version of the conversation typically happens most often directly with their program manager, or whomever's running the actual physical on-site location, who could better answer kind of those PPE questions, like what's in place, what does it look like, are we doing rotations, skiffs, all of that good stuff, and what does it really feel like in real life?
Right. So our favorite answer at Boost, which is our least favorite, and it depends.
Always.
That is always it depends.
Depends.
Yes.
Yep.
But that kind of tip, puts us back onto the topic of culture. And Caitlin, I'm going to throw this one to you. What are some of the top things companies can do to encourage a positive, company culture when working remote? If it is going to be long-term, or if there's going to be that shift back to, whatever the real world was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Nicole kind of just touched on it a little bit, that there certainly is like a legal bare minimum, but like, we don't like people that do bare minimum things. Like, you don't like people that do bare minimum stuff. Like, do the right thing, right? Like, do the real, actual right thing. It's not that difficult, guys. Like, just be good people. So one of the things that in recruiting, we get asked about company culture all the time, almost always on the first phone call with a candidate, right? They'll say, tell me about the company culture. And more often than not, a very typical kind of black and white answer to give is that, oh, it's work hard, play hard. Well, what does that mean? So what I love to do personally in conversation with candidates is use actual examples. So when we're recruiting for Boost for ourselves, I love to give kind of the story example. We, as an organization, have been so fortunate to have a leadership team that is transparent, that is authentic, and actually walks the walk and talks the talk. And so they've given us all of these great stories to tell of experiences that we've actually personally had. So one that I always go to that I absolutely love is Stephanie, our CEO. Right at the outset of the whole COVID. I mean, it might have been like March or April. I'm not sure if you guys remember personally, but she did an entire kind of COVID survival kit. And she physically herself, I think it was 3 or 4 days straight, drove to every single person's house within like the tri-state area and hand delivered these COVID survival kits that had masks, that had like lotion, hand sanitizer, you name it. And it was all Boost branded stuff. And she had clearly put thought into this. And then the hand delivery, and it was all a surprise. She obviously didn't tell anybody she was coming. So for me personally, I was on an actual video call with somebody, and my doorbell rang, and I was like, it's like 11 a.m. on like a Thursday. Like, who's here, right? Like, we didn't even talk to people anymore. Like, who's coming to my house? And I went down, and there she was with her little mask on. She was all the way at the end of like my walk, but she had this huge hand basket. It was so well done, very thoughtful and intentional. And she personally hand delivered it face to face, and even in a COVID environment, face to face, obviously.
A very socially distanced face to face.
Yeah. But it was that experience, the culture experience, the corporate culture that is not only spoken to, but then experienced. And then when we're on the phone with candidates, it's very easy. It's not a sell. Like, it's a very easy conversation with. And I can think of 3 other examples of things that we've all experienced at Boost specifically that I could speak to in terms of culture. And so I think, especially in this, to Nicole's point, kind of more disconnected feel, and to the onboarding piece, to be intentional with all of your team members and your coworkers and colleagues in the way that you can connect with them when you can, and to do that, and to not just do the bare minimum. And it means more than you think it means. And the impact is huge. So, and that all kind of lends itself to retention, and it goes on and on and on. So the benefits are vast. So
when a place treats you well, you want to stay. That tends to be how it goes. And I'm also seeing a lot of balance between, the different sections of a business, and making sure that your recruiters are talking to, your HR team, and who's talking to your leadership. And so everybody kind of has the same stories that are happening, because it becomes, a full picture thing, not just a disjointed group. And you can still do that while being and working remote. I mean, the 3 of us are clearly in our own home offices right now, but we are still able to have that camaraderie and build that team that kind of helps to move forward in a positive way for the whole business.
Absolutely.
Yes. How should, and Caitlin, I'll throw this one to you again, and Nicole, feel free to jump in too. How should a leadership group or a leader from a company introduce new employees to their teams. So we've got, we've hooked in with the culture and we walk the walk and we talk the talk, but how now do we introduce those people to the team, seeing as though we're not all in the same room?
Yes. So I think there are two examples. Well, one example that I can think of that we do at Boost that I think is awesome. And then one that is just kind of, I would say, more typical of the industry. So if you can even think back to some of your own onboarding experiences in different organizations, one thing that I had experienced personally a number of times was kind of like that whole first day, like you go to lunch with your manager or you go to lunch with the team or they order it in and like you're all sitting in the conference room and you kind of get to actually try to meet and put the names and faces together of the whole team or even leadership. And I always really loved that personally. And then when we had to shift to this entirely virtual, remote, disconnected type of world, I thought, well, that doesn't necessarily have to stop, just like Stephanie kind of got creative, our CEO, in terms of coming and physically doing these gifts, the COVID survival gifts. What if you just pivoted that and made it virtual? So, order pizza, literally send Grubhub to like 3 people's house, who, the new employee, maybe their manager, a couple of colleagues, all give them, a calendar invite for say Monday at 12 noon, the pizza comes to their house and you do like one of these kind of Zoom calls or video calls, Teams, whatever works for you. And kind of have that same experience, but virtually. And then one thing that Boost has done on, I want to say it's probably like a monthly basis now, but there's a happy hour, which is the entire company does a Zoom web kind of call. And we all get to see if there are any new hires that have been made in the last month that nobody's met, hey, this is so-and-so, they're working on this team. And they also get to experience the larger organization that they can't physically see, right? Like can't walk down the hall, nobody's passing their office. So it allows them not only to kind of be brought into the fold a little bit more fully, but also be exposed to people outside of their own team that we're all kind of doing video calls within our own divisions, but I'm not necessarily on an accounting team call. So if there's a new hire over there, I wouldn't know for months, right? Like if we're not in the same space. So with these happy hours that she's holding, that the company is doing, I get the opportunity to see all sorts of people in different divisions that I don't normally have the chance to interact with. And so that kind of helps us continue to feel like we're not, on that island that Nicole's talking about, that we're not, super disconnected and far, far away. So I love that. And then the other kind of piece to both of those is that both at that lunch and also even in our happy hours, we don't talk about work. Talk about your dogs, talk about your kids, talk about all the crazy ish that's out there, but don't talk about work. Don't do it, connect differently. And that also goes a really, really, really long way.
Definitely. We do actually have a question in here and it says, for the Zoom happy hour, does someone moderate the conversation and how is that designed? So I am happy to take that if that's cool with you guys. For the happy hour, actually, it is, like we said, a Zoom setup. And usually our leadership, so either Lisa or Stephanie will run it and just make sure that everybody has a chance to say hello, especially those new hires. They get to say hello. We have them introduce themselves, tell them, do you have a dog? Do you have a cat? Do you have kids? Where do you live? What is your view right now? That's my favorite question that's always asked. Like, what are you looking at? So there will be people who are sitting outside on their deck in front of, the lake and there's like a giant yacht going by and you're like, where are you? Where are you and how can I get there? So I do think that a lot of the time, our leadership is always on those calls to make sure that, everybody kind of feels included, and it's somewhat of an unspoken point person sort of thing. But we all make sure, especially the leadership, the directors tend to be on as well to make sure that people from their team are included and that we kind of keep that conversation up, because you don't want there to be any sort of a lull in that conversation. So making sure we kind of ask those questions. And I have to say, we do always come away with, a list of new TV shows to watch.
Mm-hmm. Always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So tons of those. I am actually going to throw it back now because I want to get a little bit more into some of the more legally required things that we can take action on here. So Nicole, I know we talked a little bit about the PPE, but aside from that, especially in this government contracting space, what are companies legally required to provide in most cases for remote work? Does it have to be computers? Does it have to be, a supplement for Wi-Fi or whatever it might be? Is there something that they are legally required to provide?
So I'm not a lawyer, but I will say this. For tangible things, legally, there's very few things that companies need to that they are legally required to provide. Now, granted, if they're welders or they have to wear uniforms, hazmat suits, those things the company is really supposed to require, provide, and it's required by OSHA regulations at least. But as far as computer equipment, that's none of that is legally required. Now, you're going to want to think as a business, is that something that you want to put on the shoulders of that new hire? Because most people are going to say no. I don't have the means to buy my own laptop. I always tell my friends when they're interviewing for these types of roles, you have to think very carefully when you're using your own laptop for company work. So I think as an organization, you have to take those things into consideration. The one thing I do want to suggest is that you remember as a hiring manager, as an organization, that just because you're paying someone a high salary doesn't mean that that's indicative of what their financial situation is. So if they don't have Wi-Fi, that's really not your place to judge as to why. So if they come to you and say, hey, look, I don't have Wi-Fi, but I'm making $300,000 a year, you don't know what their situation is. I know a lot of people who live out in West Virginia, their Wi-Fi isn't the greatest. And so they all have hotspots. So you want to look for accommodations for things like that. But legally, unless it's protective equipment as what's required by OSHA, there is nothing that you are legally required to provide. Tangibly, this is a different story. Tangibly, anything that is legally required in the workplace with regards to sexual harassment, intimidation, retaliation, those things, they're required no matter where you are. You fall under the same laws if someone works remotely in their backyard, in their home, as if they were in your office. It's just as easily to be sexually harassed over Zoom calls, over email, over text. And trust me, you think people wouldn't do it. They do it all the time. So you want to keep that in mind, that you're still under those same laws. And it's funny because I tell people this and they don't believe me, but if you get injured on the job at home, that's still a workers' comp claim that's reportable under OSHA. And you still have to report that and take care of it and have it reviewed for possible workers' comp. Same thing for accommodations. If an employee comes to you, my favorite story, and those of you who have worked with me, my favorite story is always the chair. You're a company making $1 billion and you won't provide a ergonomic chair for someone, $1,500, and then they go and sue and you're paying $2 million. Do you really want to be that organization? So if an employee comes to you and says, hey, look, I need an accommodation, I have got carpal tunnel, I have vision problems, you're still going to have to do the same interactive discussion with them as you would if they were in the office. So you really want to take into consideration that all of these things, they all affect your culture. To me, everything is about culture, especially in onboarding, because you're under a spotlight. And other employees find out about these things. If someone had a bad onboarding experience, other employees will find out. So I just think it's important to remember that there really isn't, while there are a lot of changes, on the same time, there aren't that many changes working remote as working in a physical office. And you definitely want to make sure your workers' comp carrier, your bills are up to date and things like that, because that's not something that legally you can drop.
That's a great point to make, that, if you do get injured at home while you're working, on company time, you do have to report it.
Yes.
It's not a hear no evil, see no evil sort of
Yes.
thing. It's
Now,
you've got to pay attention.
Now, granted, if you drop a plate and hurt yourself or do something while you're taking out the garbage, that's not most likely going to be considered workers' comp. If you're on a ladder changing a light bulb and it's in your office, it may be, not a ladder, a chair. That's actually happened to me too. Someone was on a rolling chair at home, changed the light bulb, slipped and broke her arm, and that actually was covered under workers' comp. So there are situations, but again, if you injure yourself doing something other than working at home, that most likely is not going to be considered.
So be careful, use common sense, try not to get hurt.
Yes.
But make sure everything is, taken care of beforehand. So if something were to happen, worst case scenario, you are covered.
Yes.
This will actually go back to a little bit, the must-have tools. So Nicole, if you had to do everything, if you had to put like a must-have list, what are the must-have tools that you would want to see a company have for digital onboarding?
So it's really no different. Again, I think your major takeaway from me should be that a whole lot is really no different than being in present in an office setting. You want to make sure that your connectivity is robust, that, if you have a difficult way of piping into your internet, that you have very succinct instructions on how to do that. Because again, when you're new, you don't know who to ask. You've never used this type of tool. I know I worked at one company where it was like a 5-step process, and it took me like 6 months to figure it out. And you had to pick whether you were on the East Coast or the West Coast. So you want to make sure that there are documents that they can get to outside of your network in case you're at home and you can't log in. Nobody wants a computer that doesn't work when you're at home, because again, these are all the same things I went back to saying before. I'm on this island. I don't know how to get in touch with anyone. My computer keeps crashing. I don't know what to do. So you really want to make sure that your tools are robust. And come to think about it, I think we've all been in situations where we're trying to work, and it doesn't matter how long you've worked for the company, your laptop crashes, you get the blue screen of death, and what do you do? So you can imagine if you're a long tenured employee and you're having technological issues and you're frustrated, imagine what it's like when you're new. So I think those are the things that in my wish list, it's really about having the proper communications in place, ways to make it comfortable where people can call you if they're having problems connecting. Make sure that your phone, your internet, your laptops are robust and as new as possible, and there are no login issues. And the Wi-Fi thing, I can't stress that enough, that if they don't have Wi-Fi, or if they're in a bad Wi-Fi, make sure that they have some way to get Wi-Fi. Typically it would be through a hotspot.
Definitely. I feel like I see a lot of companies when they get ready to hire, and Caitlin, you might be able to speak to this too. So when they get ready to hire, they really want to have like their handbook in place and things like that are very important for onboarding new clients or new employees, both technically. But when you are onboarding a new employee, it seems to be that you should also have that well-documented process for how you do each of these things, so that no matter which team is onboarding or helping to onboard, they have a similar experience. Is that something that we can kind of say yes or no to either way? Nicole, I'll go ahead and hand that one to you.
Oh, so yeah. So I just think, yes, there's always a good reason to have processes in place, robust processes, and know that they'll change. Maybe you have a different process for remote versus in person. You want to keep them as consistent as possible, and know that, look at it, revisit it every few months and see, is this working? Does this need to be changed? I like to have checklists I actually give to the employees so that they know too what's going on. I know I see a lot of schedules and things like that where, hey, on your first day, you're going to get a schedule, you meet with these people. But I also like to get an actual tangible checklist in my hand that by this time a month, I will have reached this goal. 90 days out, I worked at a large organization where they had a lot of infrastructure with regards to onboarding. And one of the things that they had was this checklist. So it was really awesome. I got this whole packet full of documents, and one of them was my checklist, so that I could follow up if I didn't get something I needed. So, again, having all of that stuff in place is great, knowing that you have to go with the flow when your handbook isn't updated. It's definitely not something I recommend you go too far out without having an updated handbook, but know, like, hey, a new one's coming out, but a new one hasn't come out yet, so I'm going to give you the old one. So, that's another thing. I still like paper handbooks. Okay. I guess I'm old school like that. I like paper, even if you're remote.
Can we do Kindle? Can we do digital so we can flip through, save some trees?
You can do that. I still like paper in some cases. And so if an employee requests paper, you either send it to Kinko's for them or send them a copy in the mail. But just always having that stuff available is really great. There's almost nothing that you can do positively for a new hire that's gonna hurt.
Okay. I like that. And Caitlin, in that, in that process of, having the checklist or, having the process for onboarding, is that something that you kind of help to create in your position to hand off? Because I would assume that there's some sort of handoff there where they go from you to, their hiring manager and kind of bridge that gap in between so that there's nobody falls through the cracks.
Yeah, so typically what happens is kind of that candidate experience then transitions into an employee experience, right? So there is absolutely a mixture of my role and Nicole's role and kind of a gray area handoff, which of course we like to be thoughtful about and not haphazard. To Nicole's point, of course, about kind of having all your ducks in a row and making sure that they even have a checklist themselves, that they are aware in terms of transparency if they ever need anything. Another kind of like piece of paper thing that I loved in my own personal onboarding experience was one that had kind of all of those points of contact, right? Like, here's your HR person, because again, you don't know who anybody is. Like, you have no idea who Susie Q is and that she's in payroll, because then again, you're sitting in your house now that we're all remote and you're like, I have no idea who even to ask this question to. So I loved kind of even having that, or like an org chart, something, right? Anything. But yes, absolutely. So when the candidate experience kind of shifts and transitions into that actual employee and through the onboarding experience, that is kind of where we do the handoff.
Yeah, so it's not a hard break. It's more of just a handling from one to the other. I'm going to ask about a question for leadership and retention. So, Caitlin, how can leadership go above and beyond to increase retention, especially post-COVID, in this atmosphere where people are not seeing one another daily?
Yes. So I think that retention as a topic as a whole, I love, because it is kind of the end result or the culmination of the candidate experience and the onboarding experience into the employee experience. And then now we have a retention thing, right? And what that actually is in real life is the person's actual experience in the role in real life, right? Was the job that we said it would be the job that it is? Has your experience been what you thought it would be? Were we transparent? Were we authentic? Were you vastly surprised when you got there and it was nothing like what you thought it would be? And if so, why? Right? That's a whole other set of kind of issues to dig into, that if you are experiencing any sort of turnover, or if you feel like your organization is having some challenges with retention, I would strongly encourage and suggest that you kind of do a deep dive into the actual employee experience. And why that is. Why are they leaving, voluntary or involuntary? Because I think there's good feedback to be had in both instances. So things that an organization could do to not necessarily mitigate that, but be thoughtful, is that you need to be transparent and authentic and strategic up front. So when we're defining a role, whether that's for us internally on a corporate level at Boost or with our clients, I'm very clear in my questions, like, no, what actually is this job in real life? Like, what are the expectations? What are some of the deliverables? What will they have their review based on in a year? Like, what are the metrics for success here? What does an actual day feel like for them? What are the challenges? What's the worst part about this job going to be? What's the best part going to be? And really trying to create a full, authentic picture of the role. Because to just transactionally throw someone in a seat and think that they're not going to figure that out in the first 5 minutes of being there, we're all lying to ourselves, and you're creating a cycle of, again, of the retention, right? And the turnover, and having to backfill that, which then is a kind of a ding on the employer brand. Obviously, there's a whole element of candidate and employee experience that goes to employer branding, and then that either helps or hinders our ability to continue to recruit for the company as a whole. So it's a vast cycle, and all these different elements and aspects affect one another far more than most people think that they do. A lot of organizations either don't look at it at all, don't even realize that there is a cycle here and these things do affect one another, or they look at it in very siloed aspects. So I would just also suggest that you, and you could even do this, I love to map things out on like giant Post-it notes, starting with literally like, we think we need to hire somebody, through creating a job description, through the entire recruiting life cycle, the transition piece and through HR's onboarding, and then the retention aspect, which is kind of, leadership, the actual physical doing of the job in the role and what it actually was in real life, and figure out if any part of that is not performing the way that you want it to, and then really do something about it.
I like that Post-it idea. I like actually being able to see it from one to the, because I think in so many instances we have, you have your recruiting team, you have your HR team, you have, the daily operations people, and I don't think that they tend to work as well together as we would like. So really kind of having that melding of conversations and processes and putting them all together to make sure that they work, so that when you do find that stellar employee, that stellar new hire, that they stay. Because I think, Nicole, you mentioned that 2 years is a typical, if they're going to leave, they're going to leave in 2 years. And while that may seem, in 2020, 2 years may seem like a long time, but in reality, 2 years to rehire for a position every 2 years seems arduous.
I actually think it's less now.
Less now?
It's less than 2 years, yes.
See, to me, that's terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that would be kind of hard for when you get somebody in, you put the effort into them, or if you haven't put the effort in and that's why they leave, that's where you then find, the problem there with some of that retention. So kind of putting that together into a whole process would, I assume, be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to invite people who are, joining us today. If you have any questions, I'm going to do a little recap here. And so I'm going to let Caitlin and Nicole kind of correct me where I'm wrong, since they are the experts here and I am the listener. But I'm going to do a little recap of some of the stuff that we talked about. So if you have questions, now would be the great time to either put them in the chat or throw them in the Q&A to make sure that we get to those before we wrap up. We are going to try and get you a couple minutes back, but I did just want to kind of do a quick recap of some of the things. So we talked about kind of the hiring in the beginning. So we talked about basically where do you find these new people and how has that changed? And from what Caitlin said, yes, it has changed a bit, but there are certain, you're not networking in person, but you're definitely going out there and trying to find from that talent pool and trying to find some of those people. And they could, they're up and looking. People are more often online than they were before. So they're able to find those positions. And I do have to say, personally, from a Glassdoor perspective, if your company uses Glassdoor, and I know there are a lot of places that when people are looking to find new employment, they go to Glassdoor first. So if you're on there and search around, all of a sudden you're getting emails about you'd be a great fit here, you'd be a great fit here. So it's important to kind of have your presences up in all of those spaces. So Caitlin, did I recap that correctly? Did I need to mention anything else that I missed?
No, that's perfect.
Good. One check for listening. And then we went into kind of the onboarding in the first days. So making sure that you start not on the first day, but a couple of days beforehand. So making sure that they have everything they need. Nicole was really great to mention that if they need to have a device, if they need to have, certain tools at their disposal to do their job, that you get them there 48 hours in advance business-wise. So not on, if they're starting on Monday, you're not giving it to them on Saturday, you're giving it to them a couple of days before during the week so that you are available to answer those questions should they have them, as well as having those processes in place and making sure that they know the expectation and giving them a little bit of leniency when it comes to kind of figuring out what to do in those first couple months, knowing that they should continue and their trajectory of effectiveness should actually grow as they learn kind of the ropes around there. Nicole, anything I missed on that part?
No, I think you yep, just wonderfully.
Perfect. And then I am going to, Caitlin just talked beautifully about retention, so I'm not even going to sum that up because you did such a fantastic job there. But I am going to ask both of our speakers today what their number one actionable takeaway is from today's discussion. So Caitlin, I'll go ahead and start with you. What is the one thing that we can tell those who are joining us today to go and do right now to be successful?
Yes, great question. And I think I kind of gave it up actually in my last answer a little bit, but I would really encourage you to thoughtfully sit down, map out how recruiting, onboarding, and retention all affect one another. And if there are any places in your business in which they're not thriving the way that you want them to, any challenges that you see, that you make it a point to really kind of take a look at that and make a plan for turning it around. And of course, if you need help on strategy, give Boost a call. We got you. We can help you figure that out and turn it around and get you where you need to be, because they all affect each other far more than I think you realize.
Oh, that's a great point. And on that note, if you are doing the giant Post-it note thing, most of those office supply stores do deliver. So you can order it and have it delivered. They have the sticky ones. They go right on the wall there. So just a tip there from, you know, the actual writing down point. Nicole, for you, what is your number one actionable takeaway there?
So I think the most actionable takeaway is to remember that your first impression isn't just the interview. It's also the onboarding. So there's a line from Van Wilder that I love: interviews are dates. So when you're on a date, you have your best foot forward. Once you get that person, you're in a relationship, you kind of let your guard down, sometimes sooner than not. So I think it's important that you don't let your guard down during the onboarding process for a very long time. Hopefully you're not just putting on a show for your interview, but if you are putting your best foot forward, just make sure that you understand that someone is coming in and they're not seeing all the bad stuff right away, but also remembering that you shouldn't have any bad stuff. So if you start off with everyone with every single thing that they need, and you're understanding that someone's new, so you're maybe giving them, you know, leniency with deadlines, with understanding where everything are, it's going to go a whole lot farther than throwing them into the pit and sucking from a fire hose. I think that's the saying, because regardless of how much information you give to someone for the first, I'd say easily the first 12 weeks, you are sucking water from a hose. So just understand that that's what's going on. And like I've said, I don't think it makes a difference whether or not you're remote or not. Onboarding is the same, but just keeping in mind that remote onboarding is far more difficult on the new hire than it is on the manager.
Definitely make sure you take care of your people.
Yes,
I'm hearing a lot of take care of your people.
Absolutely.
I am going to go ahead and put up how you can get in touch with our speakers today. If you joined us late or you missed part of today's broadcast, we will definitely be sending out a replay. We did record this, so we will be sending out the replay. If, you know, after you've kind of marinated on some of the things that we talked about today, if you have questions that arise, you can get in touch with either of our speakers or from the Boost website for a consultation there, and we will get into answering those questions for you. I thank both Caitlin and Nicole. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, and being part of, you know, everything that was going on, and sharing, you know, the stuff that you know and have experienced, and, you know, all of the great information with us. So we truly appreciate that. Anything else from you two before I cut you off?
No.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on the next webinar that we have. Make sure you check back and follow us on all of those social profiles so you can stay in touch with the things that we're doing, sharing, and as we help you grow. Have a fantastic day, and we will see you again very soon.
Thank you.